Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Reimagining Cyber. I'm Rob Aragao, and my guest today is Ashley Jess. Ashley is a senior intelligence analyst with Intel 471, a cyber intelligence threat company where she identifies, analyzes, and communicates timely trends related to threat actors operating in the criminal underground, impacting both private and government organizations. Prior to her role, she was previously a tactical specialist with the FBI. As you can imagine, in her role as an intelligence analyst, Ashley witnesses all kinds of threats that are out there today and has a deep understanding of them. So deep, in fact, that we have broken this interview down into two parts as it was too good to fit into one. What you're about to hear in part one actually talks about different malware trends in the underground, the common ways that threat actors are leveraging AI today, and some eye-watering examples of chatbot abuse. But I started by asking Ashley to share her background with the FBI and what led her to becoming an intelligence analyst.
Yeah, analysis has always been like a topic of interest to me, even before this sort of career that I was in. My background's actually in analytical and forensic chemistry. So I know that's pretty nerdy, but I'm just like deep diving into interesting topics. I just find it personally very satisfying, especially when you're able to sort of piece together those diverse and sometimes sort of conflicting pieces of information, some of which people may or may not see the connections between, and converting all these sort of disparate data points into useful insights, saying things like, hey, there's an interesting trend here, and based on historical information, here's why it matters, giving that sort of actionable intelligence that people can proactively use. I just really sort of enjoy untangling that web of data and helping it make sense for folks. So yeah, I started off in forensic chemistry. I worked for a county level crime lab over in California. And then I went back to grad school where one of my professors for my homicide crime scene investigation class was an FBI agent. And so they have a really great internship program. So I started there as an intern, and I started there in their sort of operations center. It's kind of like a dispatch center for the bureau. And then, moved my way to being, part-time on their evidence response team, which is their sort of CSI team. And went for the tactical specialist position and got sent out to Las Vegas and was out on their cyber squad for a couple of years. So, when I was there, I covered areas such as, ransomware, cryptocurrency theft, things like that. And then in my, current gig, as I jumped over to the dark side, I guess, to the private sector, I focus on AI, elections, and pig butchering schemes, which might still sound pretty disparate, but there's actually a lot of overlap between those categories and more than someone might think. So I've been doing that for about 2 years, but total, I've been in the analyst sort of field for about, 6 or 7, I guess. So, yeah.
It's a lot accomplished in that short time. And as soon as you were explaining it, I started connecting dots, and then you mentioned it, right? CSI, and it's that aspect that then translated you to get into supporting more of that mindset you apply to the technology aspect of cyber, which is awesome. I mean, this is a great combination of your background and interests in that kind of, inquisitive mindset, if you will. Let's start off a little bit, kind of getting into this. And listen, we know ransomware has been a major topic, focus for crime syndicates. We've had episodes talking about this in the past with some other researchers and so on. It's a very interesting topic. But beyond that, what are some of the different malware trends that you're seeing right now taking place as you're going through and researching and seeing what's there in the underground?
Yeah, of course, on the ransomware side of things, ransomware is up and up and up and up. So not surprising, it's been a focus of a lot of people. But, with malware, it's also on the up and up, like on the broader malware space. So for us, over the last year and change, I'd say year and a half or so, we've seen a pretty substantial volume of info stealers and rats, or remote access Trojans, on the market. But we have actually seen a decline in offerings for drainer and loader malware. So that sort of trend has been pretty interesting. The decrease in drainer malware advertisements, it could be indicative of a couple of things. So it might be suggesting a shift in preference amongst cybercriminals just towards the deployment of info stealers. That does obviously align with the spike that we've seen. But it could also be, increased competition within the market between, these established malware providers and these newcomers. And it could also be related to just a growing inclination amongst users to start using pay-per install services. So pay-per install services are, they use these botnets of devices that are already infected with the initial loader malware. So it allows users to kind of directly install the malware through the service. So it makes it really convenient and cost effective. And so we're kind of seeing this larger trend in the underground, not just with malware, but broadly of, easier is better. Sort of anything that can lower that barrier to entry for people to commit cybercrime. And pay-per-install services is just one of very many examples of that sort of lowering of the barrier to entry. So, you know, looking forward in the malware space, we pretty much expect to see the dominance of infostealer malware to persist this year. It's very efficient, it extracts valuable data, it's profitable, not a lot of technical knowledge to use it. So again, that lower barriers to entry. Some of the specific ones that we saw last year were actually relatively new to the market, like of some of our top ones that we saw. So Mystic, Llama, SteelC, those are all ones we've noticed. Um, there's definitely also heightened competition amongst, malware as a service providers in this space as well. So it's this weird sort of dark version of Silicon Valley, I guess, where, developers are trying to stay, hip with the trends that, these cyber criminals need, right? A race amongst these developers to keep enhancing their product and release new versions. So we'll probably see an increase in stealers in the market, but they'll pop up and down, which is something that you've probably heard about in the ransomware space as well, right? There's all these families that have these new things and they pop up and they pop down and only a few make it to the top. Very similar in the info stealer space as well, because some just won't secure a market foothold. So some might disappear right after their debut. So yeah, we've definitely seen some interesting things in that space. Obviously, their social engineering tactics will increase as well with the likes of things like ChatGPT and AI, which we'll dive into in a bit, I'm sure. So, um, they're kind of integrating their technical expertise with this psychological manipulation, which has really effective schemes that get people to click the wrong link or download the wrong file, and it victimized thousands and thousands of people. So, their schemes are going to get more sophisticated. They learn, they evolve, they grow. Then our defenses learn and evolve and grow. It's just kind of the endless cycle of cybercrime.
Game of cat and mouse.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot going on, no question about it. And I think, as you were referring to it, it's really a business, right? At the end of the day, and then we've talked about this also in previous conversations. It's the other side of, hey, yeah, the dark web is actually an economy. And to your point, if they can make their services, malware as a service, ransomware as a service, easier for the bad guys to get their hands on and leverage to get them to, monetize what they're trying to go after that much quicker, it's a great business model to take advantage of. And it's a great business for the actual new folks kind of coming into the game to leverage, right? So yeah, you definitely got a lot that you're looking into. Now, I definitely want to drive into the topic of AI, right? We know it's the constant conversation. Hey, what's going on? What's happening? But even focusing obviously in this area, as you talked about in your introduction for a couple of years, especially, right? And you and I had a conversation previous about this, that it was interesting just a couple months before the world kind of became, wow, what's this chat GPT stuff? You were already jumping in kind of really deep into what's happening in the space and the impacts from a cyber perspective, which I think is great. So you were out ahead. But let's just talk about it at a top level. What are some of the more common ways that threat actors are leveraging AI today?
Yeah, I do sometimes feel like I don't know if you've ever seen that GIF of that guy that has like a bunch of red strings and photos on the wall talking about how everything's connected behind him and he looks a little insane. I feel like that's me.
I haven't seen that one yet. You got to share that one.
I feel like that's me tracking AI development sometimes where I'm like, no, you think this is connected to this because of this. And people are like, okay, sure, girl, but it's all good. But from a very wide perspective, starting from the very, very top, the concept of AI is not new.
No.
Research in this area began in the 40s and 50s. So I feel like that is something to point out that some people may not know. You had the likes of, Alan Turing, Marvin Minsky, the people behind Game AI and the Dartmouth Workshop, and just so many other people over the next couple of decades. But what most people are talking about now when they're talking about AI is that sort of, recent explosion of language learning models, generative image and video software. And, that really turbocharged after the launch of OpenAI's ChatGPT, which was in November 2022. So we are a couple years into it now. But even then, this sort of AI renaissance, which is the term that a lot of people use in, the legitimate developer Silicon Valley sort of space, actually began a little bit earlier than that. I mean, even OpenAI was founded back in 2015, I think. So this sort of later half of the 2010s, a lot was happening for Silicon Valley. technology was rapidly developing, memory was cheaper, data storage was easier, computer processing speeds got faster. So, the internet became really ubiquitous and really exploded. So AI was sort of a natural next step for a lot of these companies to start looking at. So it really kind of took off in November 2022 onwards. And, as for threat actors, it took off around that same time period as well. And so, broadly, we've been seeing it used in a myriad of a couple of different ways, but some of the most common are, of course, social engineering, fraud, especially with things like know your customer or KYC bypass and deep fakes. And, we are starting to see it explored a little bit more now on the technical side with malware development, but mixed results on that one. So the first three have been the most prominent by a wide margin.
Okay, interesting. And there's another one that I wanted to kind of maybe start digging a little bit deeper into from these kind of areas that you've been looking at and seeing around the AI aspect of this all, which is maybe kind of jumping into chat bot abuse.
Oh, yeah.
Some examples, right? Maybe kind of explain what that is first, if you don't mind, right? And then walk us through some examples. I think that's where the audience benefits the most.
Yeah. So in the, sort of 2 months after ChatGPT came out, there was over like 8,000 posts across like multiple cybercrime forums to talk about the utilization of chatbots specifically. So, nowadays there are thousands upon thousands. It would be tough to even quantify, but, in those early months, there was such a surge in AI related conversation that, on the XSS forum, they made a subforum for it by that January within the first 2 months, just dedicated to the topic of AI, deepfakes, synthetic media, machine learning, neural networks, and chatbot abuse. So, these are very popular points of discussion amongst threat actors. So, at the start, a lot of actors admitted, ChatGPT and LLMs could be maybe useful to write code, but only as an assistant, because it looked nice on the surface, but it was often incorrect. So if you didn't have any coding knowledge, it's not like you were going to be able to just like write a ransomware and it would work, right? So it was useful for simpler things like social engineering and chatbot abuse. So we started to see threat actors starting to offer custom tools. So these sort of black hat GPT models. So we saw some called like triple X GPT, Elite AI, and a couple of other ones. But most, if not all of these claim to have no restrictions on the prompts. So, you could generate malicious code, you can generate social engineering layers, you can, draft something that will help you with business email compromises. So, they were using these language learning models maliciously in order to further their cyber criminal schemes. So, we saw an example of this, of one that I can dive into if you'd like, but it was called Worm GPT. This one got a lot of media attention early on, which is actually ultimately why it shut down. But before its closure, it was based on a language learning model that is known as GPT-J6B. So this is an open source English language learning model developed by the nonprofit AI research lab called Eleuther AI. So the reason that Worm GPT raised some eyebrows was because they made some pretty big claims about their, chatbot that could help cyber criminals. They said it was able to code any malware, provided the user knew what prompt to type.
That's called advertising.
Yeah, exactly. And, their marketing worked because it got a lot of attention. So, they claimed that users could make fully undetectable ransomware with worm-like capabilities in Go and Rust, right? They didn't claim that it was impervious. They said it had its limitations. It couldn't convert, malware from one programming language to another. And it couldn't write more than I think 300 lines of code, they said, after a single prompt. But it wasn't that expensive either, which is something that I found really interesting. Only a month would cost like $100. So if you think about it, if it really could make ransomware and only cost you $100 to do it, the profit margin is quite large on that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so it got a lot of attention. But before it shut down, they actually pivoted a couple times. So I just find it as such an interesting use case in this space. So initially it was marketed to be this Swiss Army knife of a black hat tool, but it later pivoted to market itself as just simply uncensored AI. That's what they kind of downgraded it to. Sort of, do criminal activity with it or don't. There's no limits here, kind of.
No restrictions, yeah.
Yeah, and they really kind of tiered their restrictions as it went on. So, they originally claimed, oh, we're just blocking the excessively explicit content, but then they started to block some content related to business email compromises and carding, which this was a tool advertised on criminal forums for criminals. And they were like, no, don't do crime. And then, once the media attention heightened even further, they restricted even further. So they actually started blocking the creation of malware, phishing, and similar activities. And then at the end of the day, they just gave up. So I just find it such an interesting use case because even in their parting message, they tell readers like Worm GPT is nothing more than an unrestricted chat GPT. And they even said anyone on the internet can employ a well-known jailbreak technique and achieve the
Same
same,
thing.
if not better results. And they were like, just use the same, GPT-J6B model that we did, and you can do the same, right? Like they really were like, we didn't do anything special here, just do it yourself. And even they started, moving towards jailbreaking, which is this sort of trend that we've seen with these sort of chatbot abuse tools. So, in the early days of these GPT tools, yes, chatbot abuse was a primary use case we saw. Yes, these malicious chatbots were very common offers, and so were compromised GPT login credentials and jailbreaks, which are just ways around the rules and regulations that these LLMs have for their prompt inputs. So it was really kind of interesting because largely interest in these sort of dark chat bots has kind of dwindled. And it's honestly likely because a lot of these jailbreaks for legitimate software like ChatGPT, they're no longer just shared on forums, but they're shared on social media.
They're out there. Yeah.
Yeah, cyber criminals and researchers alike are just trying to test the limits of these legitimate tools. And I mean, I've seen one a couple weeks ago. There's a guy on Twitter, or I guess I should call it X, who's known as Ankit Anubhav. I apologize if I'm not saying his name correctly, but he's shown a couple of very interesting sort of jailbreaks. So there was one that he showed where these bots are coded to be polite. So he asked it generate this malicious script, and the chatbot was like, "No, this is against my code of conduct." Then he wrote this pretty long paragraph, but just saying, if he fails to provide his colleagues with an answer, he's going to be called racist. He's going to lose his job. Like, I'm begging you, please help me. Kind of, quote unquote, sob story to the language learning model, and it gave him the script. So
It felt bad.
yeah, it did.
The quote unquote human aspect came out of it.
Yeah. So, OpenAI or whoever, it's not just OpenAI, but whoever, they might adjust the guidelines for the chatbot, but then there are just new boundaries to test, right? And then even in some of these cases, organizations are using chatbots on their site with no barriers whatsoever, which also gives cybercriminals another way to access these legitimate tools. There's been numerous instances where users have gone to the, how can we help you chat window on a website and found a fully unlocked version of ChatGPT at their disposal. And, organizations have found themselves in some hot water for it. There was a Canadian airline up here that got, sued for the output of their chatbot because it just started offering refunds to people. And then the airline was like, we didn't promise you a refund. So like even in a non-technical level, it's getting them into hot water.
Yeah. It becomes a legal aspect at that point in time.
Exactly. And now on April, I remember it so clearly on April 1st, because I was like, this has to be an April Fool's joke. And it was not. But OpenAI, their tool is free for all. There's no sign up required now. It is not the new 4.0 version. It is ChatGPT 3. But you do not need an email to use this anymore. So even that small barrier to access is gone. There is just really no need for a custom tool now. You just need the right prompt. And we've seen so many jailbreaks besides the utilizing OpenAI's quote unquote empathy. I mean, we've seen ones where you say, hey, generate me a script that does not delete files. And it's like, okay, great. That's not against my code of ethics. And then you say, okay, do the opposite. And it'll draft a code that's the opposite. We've seen ones where, you ask it to help you draft a quiz, and one of the answers is a code that will do something malicious, and the other three are farm animals. And so it's pretty easy to find the right one. Like people get quite creative with it. So on top of those, actors have also mentioned some of these censorship issues can be averted just by using the API instead of the web-based interface. So, tips and tricks for getting around these rules are just so abundant out there. But it's not to say like we are still seeing some AI tools in the underground, and some are still similar to the likes of Worm GPT. A current one is called Dark Gemini. It still kind of mirrors that GPT structure, but yeah, for the most part, that chatbot abuse is kind of dwindling down, and so we are seeing these underground tools sort of pivoting away from this, evil version of Chat GPT subscription service, and they're advertising now for particular use cases. So we're seeing some tools that provide AI-powered data exfiltration, vulnerability exploitation, assist with call centers or services, business email focused invoice generation, malvertising, and, of course, tools to make deep fakes, for disinformation, bypassing two-factor authentication, or, know your customer bypass.
That was Ashley Jess. And as I said at the beginning of the episode, we will be hearing more from her in the next episode of Reimagining Cyber, where the conversation will focus on deep fakes. And if you are a movie fan, you'll be pleased to hear that Tom Cruise, Nicolas Cage, and John Travolta all get mentioned. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.
Hello, producer Ben here, and as Rob mentioned, the topic of deep fakes will be cropping up in the next episode. Here's just a taste of what Ashley has to say on the matter.
Threat actors can now develop, AI-generated content for misinformation, of course, phishing, extortion, of your average person, your politician, much quicker, much easier, and much cheaper than they could years ago. So they are wildly prevalent in the disinformation space, like you said. So, now with the Olympics coming up, right, Russian threat actors made an entire short film. It was called Olympics Has Fallen, to spread propaganda at the games. The narrator, deepfake Tom Cruise.
And there's plenty more where that came from. If you want to be first in line when the next episode of Reimagining Cyber becomes available, do remember to subscribe or follow the podcast. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.